Hello student, how are you all? I hope you all are alright. Once again we are here to read about English language and literature, and on this series we are going to read today The Age of Shakespeare, the non-dramatic verse. The Age of Shakespeare. We now enter what we broadly call the Shakespearean Age, by which we here mean the whole period extending from the accession of Elizabeth in 1558 to the death of James I in 1625. These 67 years fall naturally into three divisions: the first 20 years of the Queen's reign, the 24 years between the publication of Spencer Shepherd's calendar and her death, and the 22 years of the reign of James I. We may call the first division the time of preparation or the spring tide of Elizabethan literature, the second its time of full fruition or summer, the third its time of decline or autumn. Strictly speaking, it is of course to the first two divisions only that the term Elizabethan should be applied, while the proper designation for the third is Jacobean. But from the point of view of literary development, there are good reasons why Elizabethan and Jacobean should alike be included in the general phrase which we use here, the Age of Shakespeare. The virtue of its wonderful fertility and of the variety and splendor of its production, this period as a whole ranks as one of the greatest in the annals of the world literature. Its greatness was the result of many cooperative causes. As we follow the course of history, we observe that sometimes the average mood of nation is sluggish and dull, and sometimes it is exceptionally vigorous and alert. Men who like Spencer, Bacon and Shakespeare grew from boyhood into youth in the early years of Elizabethan's reign. They reached maturity during the closing decade of the 16th century. Were fortunate enough to find themselves in a world in which the tides of life were at their highest. Influences were everywhere at work which tended to expand thought, stir the feeling, delight the imagination, and by nourishing as well as stimulating genius, to give breath and energy to the literature produced. England now felt the full effect of revival of learning, which was no longer limited to the scholarly few at the universities and about the court, since innumerable translations carried the treasure of the classic far and wide through the large miscellaneous public to which the originals would have been sealed books. In this way, as has been well said, every breeze was dusty with the pollen of Greece, Rome and Italy, and even the general atmosphere was charged with the spirit of new learning. An appetite for literature was thus fostered, and an immense impetus given to the sense of beauty and the growing love of everything that made for the enrichment of life. While the Renaissance aroused the intellect and the aesthetic faculties, the Reformation awakened an spiritual nature. The same printing press which diffused the knowledge of the classic put the English Bible into the hands of the people, and the spread of an interest in the religion inevitably accompanied by a deepening of normal earnest. The recent discovery of new worlds beyond the seas and the thrilling tales brought home by daring explorers like Hawkins, Drake, Frobisher and Raleigh quickened popular curiosity and the zest of adventure, kindled fresh ideas about things, and did much to enlarge the boundary of man's mind. The general prosperity of the country was also increasing, and for the first time of many years it enjoyed the blessing of internal peace. England had thrown off the yoke of foreign power in the great rupture with Rome. The fierce feud of Catholic and Protestant by which it had long been rent were now over. Its discordant element had been welded together into the United Nations, and in the crisis in which for the moment its very existence was imperiled, the collision with Spain, Englishmen found themselves sinking minor differences to stand shoulder to shoulder in defense of their common country against their common foe. An immense patriotism thus became one of the outstanding features of the age and showed itself in many ways. In a keen interest in England's past, pride in England's greatness, hatred of England's enemies, and extravagant loyalties to England's queen. Such were some of the conditions which combined to create the spirit of Shakespearean age, an age in which man lived intensely, thought intensely, and wrote intensely. At such a time when passions were strong and speculation was rife and the great public existed eager to respond to the appeal of genius, everything conspired to bring out of each man and the best that was in him, and whatever might be the individual quality of his work, the fullness and many-sidedness of the life about him were certain to be reflected in it. The Elizabethan before says Spenser. We may take the publication of Spenser's Shepherd Calendar in 1579 as marking the opening of the golden age of Elizabethan literature. In the first half of the Queen's reign, while there was a good deal of poetic activity, little verse of any distinct value was produced. By far the best poetry of the period is to be found in the contribution of Thomas Sackville, Lord Buckhurst, to an extensive undertaking entitled A Mirror of Magistrate. This originated in a publisher's scheme for a continuation of Legate's Falls of Prince, and was designed to include a long series of tragedical histories of famous Englishmen. A number of writers took part in it, but Sackville's two poems, which first appeared in the edition of 1563, The Induction and The Complaint of Buckingham, are immeasurably superior to the rest of the work. The noble but sombre Induction in particular is worthy of attention as the finest single poem written in England between Chaucer and Spenser. The Steel Glass of the George Gascoigne possesses some interest as the first regular verse satire in the English language. Spenser and his poetry. Edmund Spenser, the greatest non-dramatic poet of an age which found its most natural literary expression in the drama, was born in London in 1552 and educated at Merchant Taylor's School and at Cambridge, where he read the classic and the Italian literature and come under the influence of the strongest Protestant spirit which then pervaded Spenser and his poetry. Edmund Spenser, the greatest non-dramatic poet of an age which found its most natural literary expression in drama, was born in London in 1552 and educated at Merchant Taylor's School and at Cambridge, where he read the classics and the Italian literature and came under the influence of the strong Protestant spirit which then pervaded the university. After a couple of years spent with the relatives in Lancashire, he found a place in the household of Earl of Leicester, with whose nephew Sir Philip Sidney he formed an intimate friendship. In 1580 he went to Ireland as secretary to the new Lord Deputy, Lord Grey de Wilton, the remainder of his life save for a brief visit to London, and passed in Ireland in miserable exile among a lawless people whom he loathed. Again and again disappointed in every effort to secure a position at the court, and with this the means of returning to England, he found his only relief in the writing of his Faerie Queene. In October 1598, rebellion broke out in Tyrone, where he was then living. His castle was fired and plundered by an infuriated mob. He and his family barely escaped with their lives. In failing death and crushed in spirits, he reached London at the end of the year, and on 16 January 1599 died in an inn at Westminster. While Spenser fame rests mainly on the Faerie Queene, his minor poetry, which he voluminous, would itself have sufficed to assure him the place of preeminence among contemporary English poets. His Shepherd Calendar 1579 is a pastoral poem of the artificial kind, which the taste for everything classic, which came in with the revival of learning, had made popular in all European literatures. And in it Spenser followed the model set by the late Greek poet Theocritus, by Virgil in his Bucolica, and by French and Italian writers of the Renaissance who had imitated these. It is divided into 12 parts, one for each month of the year, and it under the guise of conventional pastoral imaginary, that is, of shepherds talking and singing. The poet writes of his unfortunate love for a certain mysterious Rosalind, deals with sundry moral questions, and discusses the religious issues of the day from the standpoint of strong Protestantism. Such conventional pastoral imaginary was again used in Astrophel, an elegy on the death of Sidney, to whom the calendar had been dedicated. His four hymns in honor of love and beauty show his wonderful power of melodious verse. His Amoreti, a series of 88 sonnets, such sonnet sequence in Petrarch manner, had gained great vogue in England under the influence of the widespread enthusiasm for Italian literature. Describe the progress of his love for Elizabeth Boyle, whom he married in 1594. That event inspired his epithalamium, the finest of all his minor poems, and by common consent the noble wedding hymn in the language. The Fairy Queen. Like the contemporary tales, the Fairy Queen is a fragment of 12 books, which Spenser projected 6 only were published during his lifetime and portions of the 7th after his death. Even as it stands, however, it is one of the longest as well as one of the greatest of English poems. According to his own statement, his plan was that while each of 12 books should be independent and self-contained, they should nonetheless be connected as part of a general comprehensive whole. His underlying scheme is explained at length in his prefatory letter to his friend Sir Walter Raleigh. The Fairy Queen, keeping her annual feast for 12 successive days, on each of these days a certain knight at her command undertook a particular adventure, each such adventure furnishing the subject of one book. Meanwhile, Prince Arthur, whom he chose as his central figure because he was the hero of the greatest British legend cycle of cavalry, having dreamed of the Fairy Queen, went forth in quest of her, falling in with the various knights who were engaged on their adventures by the way. This appearance of Arthur at the critical juncture in each of the stories was especially devised as a link between one part and another of the gigantic design. Generally, externally considered, the Fairy Queen, like its principal models, the Italian Romantic epics, is compounded of the traditional material of cavalry, giants, dragons, dwarfs, wizards, knights of superhuman power, prowess, and courage, and distressed themselves of marvelous beauty. Provide its chief character. Enchantments, tournaments, love passages, and endless fighting are the staple of its plot. But Spenser's genius was fed by the Reformation as well as by the love of medieval romance and the culture of the Renaissance, and unlike his brilliant Italian master Ariosto, who wrote only to amuse, his own great work is inspired by high moral and religious aim. In other words, the Fairy Queen is not simply a romance, it is a didactic romance. The poet, throughout using his stories as vehicles of the lesson he wished to convey, he carries out his purpose by turning romance into allegory. His 12 knights errant are types of 12 cardinal virtues of Aristotle's philosophy, and the adventure of knight are arranged to body for symbolically the experience and conflict and temptations of each such virtue in the turmoil of the world, and its ultimate triumph and aid of Arthur, the incarnation of divine power over all its foes. Thus, the great book contains the legend of the Knight of the Red Cross or Holiness, the second that of Sir Gawain or of Temperance, the third that of Britomartis or Chastity, the fourth that of Campbell and Trimond or friendship, the fifth that of Artegal or of justice, the sixth that of Sir Calidor or of courtesy. Involved with this ethical allegory, another kind of allegory enters into Spencer's plan, which, as it is directed, concerned with the political and religious problems of the age, we may call the historical, for the figure of his narrative are not merely personifications of moral and mental qualities, but often stand at the same time for individuals of institution representing or embodying the qualities in question. Thus, in the first book, we have a story of Red Cross Knight who goes out to rescue the parents of the Lady Una from the power of great dragon who for years Brazil castle. As a general allegory, this represents the work of true religion in rescuing humanity from the power of great dragon Satan, while the friends and foes whom Knight meets are the forces which aid and forces which oppose true religion in the divine work of deliverance. But Spencer identifies true religion with English Protestantism, and the foes of true religion with the foes of England, the papacy, the Rome's political allies, especially Spain and Mary of Scots, and so the two lines of allegory run together, and the poems become at the once the medium of poet's teaching and his reading of contemporary movement and events, as many of the immediate issues of Spencer's days are living issues. No longer much of his poem, if taken from this point of view, we can have the best and historic value only. His allegory is sometimes confused, inconsistent, and obscure. Many readers will feel too that the constant intrusion of symbolism sadly taxes the attention of and distracts from the human interest of the poem. Yet, as Spencer wrote his poem expressly for the purpose of embodying his ideas on many of the great questions of life, the allegory must never be altogether ignored. The defects of Fairy Queen are very obvious. It suffers from its extreme artificiality. The old machinery of romance seems almost to collapse in place under the stress of the new spiritual meanings with which it is loaded. Spencer is one of the whole rather languid storyteller. He has little dramatic power and rarely rises to the full height of his opportunities. But on the other hand, his merits are very many and very striking. He has a wonderful sense of beauty. He has a splendid pictorial power. His work is filled with the noble moral spirit, while the quality of pure essential poetry, that quality which defies analysis but can never be missed by any sympathetic reader, is to be felt on almost every page. This enables us to understand why Spencer has been called the poets of poets, and why, as we shall learn later, he exercised such a stimulating influence on the literature of the 18th century Romantic revival. It should be noted that he was not only the greatest non-dramatic poet of his epoch, he was also the most completely representative of all the cooperative forces which made Elizabethan England what it was. Entered into the texture of his poem, which more than any other single work of the time present the combination of the spirit of the Renaissance with the spirit of the Reformation. It is steeped in the humanism of the classic and Italian literature, and it every man testifies to the strenuous idealism and moral earnestness of Protestantism. Two matters of detail must be touched on before we leave his epoch-making work. First, it must not be supposed that the language in which it is written was the actual English of Spencer's day. An ardent lover of Chaucer, he employed a dialect of his own which he purposely made archaic. Secondly, as his language was his own invention, so also was the stanza which he used and which is now always known by his name. This is the 9-line stanza rhyming A B B C B C C. The last line saying what is called Alexandrine, or line of 6 iambic feet instead of 5. The genesis of this stanza is uncertain, but it is probable that Spenser evolved it by simply adding the Alexandrine to Chaucer's 8-line stave A B B C B C, the Monk's Tale. Other poets from 1579 to 1625, the minor poets of the age of Shakespeare, were very numerous, but it would serve no useful purpose to attempt a catalogue of them here. It is, however, necessary that we would learn something about the different kinds of poetry which were then written, and about a few of the men who helped to swell the chorus of Elizabethan song. Following in the wake of Tottel's Miscellany came many collections of similar character under curiously fanciful titles, such as The Paradise of Dante devices, a handful of pleasant delights, an arbor of amorous devices, and the most famous of all them, English Helicon. These, like the regular songs book which were also popular, have preserved for us many graceful pieces of verse by authors whose very names would otherwise have been forgotten. A special type of lyric which enjoyed great vogue was the sonnet, which on its introduction from Italy by Watt and Surrey at once established itself among the recognized form of English poetry. The Italian plan of writing sonnet in sequences was, as we have seen, also adopted by many poets. One such sequence, the Amoralty of Spenser, has already been mentioned, and to this we may now add, by way of further illustration, Sidney's Astrophel and Stella Daniels' Delia, Drayton's Idea, and the sonnet of Shakespeare. All these are love poems which in Italian manner trace the movement and fluctuations of passions, but while in some cases the experience and sentiments are real, in others they are merely feigned. Another class of poetry which historically is very significant because it expresses the wonderful patriotic feeling of the time is that inspired by national themes. William Warner Albion's England 1586 to 1616, the poem of some 10,000 lines, sets forth the history of England from no days to those of Elizabeth. Samuel Daniel produced a versified chronicle in 8 books on the civil wars between the two houses of Lancaster and York. Michael Drayton, who is now best known by his spirited ballad The Battle of Agincourt, has a more substantial, if not a better, claim to recognition as the author of England's heroic epistles. The Baron's Wars, the Polyolbion, an enormous poetic description of England in 30 books, which Drayton himself not unjustly referred to as his Herculean toil. We must remember that such poems were the product of same keen interest in and love for England which led scholars like Stove Harrison and Holyshedden into laborious historical researches and found dramatic expression in the chronicle plays of Shakespeare. We have spoken of the Jacobean division of the age of Shakespeare as the period of decline. By his we mean that Elizabethan inspiration was now waning, that its subject matter was getting exhausted, and that tendency to imitation was setting in among the rising generation. Meanwhile, a new kind of poetry was beginning with John Donne, whose work belonged essentially to the time of James. Though he was 30 years old when Elizabeth died, Donne, who was a celebrated divine and preacher, wrote songs, sonnets, marriage poems, elegies, and satires, all of which are characterized by much genuine poetic feeling, harsh meters, and those strained and whimsical images and turns of speech which are called conceits. His historical importance lies in the fact that he initiated the metaphysical school of poetry, of which we shall having something more to say presently. This is all about the today's reading. Now we will continue on the next video. Thank you for watching.